Can we have the first slide, please? I'm going to talk about these 3 decades when Planting Fields was created, the architecture, the gardens, and so on. In many ways, it's a very sort of typical country place. As John spoke last night, Americans, wealthy Americans at that time had this idea, primarily influenced by Europe, of building a sort of chateau or villa or country house in the British way, and sort of kind of having a make-believe weekend life. In the case, as you heard, of the Coes, a life, they had many other houses so they could play at cowboys and Indians out west and do all sorts of other things. But what is really interesting, what interested me about Planting Fields is the way it was put together. It's not all of a piece. It's not simply a no, I shouldn't say simply, but it's not an architect and a landscape architect getting together, designing a place, building it, and there you are, and it's either good or not good. These were 2 separate houses, 2 entirely separate sets of owners, 2 artists, 3 architects, and 4 landscape architects, and they all built on each other's work. And that's what interested me about it, is how they reacted to each other, how they built on each other, and what we have at the very end, which was not, as I said, a vision, a singular vision. It was this layered vision of places that come together, and in some ways certainly makes it more interesting from a historical point of view, but it also, I think, gives it a certain kind of authenticity, which a sort of instant place doesn't necessarily have. It all starts in 1904 with Helen and James Byrne. Grosvenor Atterbury was the architect, and Greenleaf was a wonderful name for a landscape architect, was the landscape architect. The Byrnes, James Byrne was a lawyer. He was a partner in a Wall Street firm, a white shoe firm, and so you would think, oh, well, he's a rich white guy, right? You would be quite wrong. He was the son of immigrants, Irish immigrants. After finishing Harvard College, he had a job as a private tutor in Philadelphia, and put himself through law school, finished cum laude, and basically made it on his wits. He was, by all accounts, an extremely good lawyer, somebody that young lawyers wanted to work for. He always got the best graduates from Harvard coming to his office. So he was an interesting man. He was also an Irish Catholic. It's hard for us to believe or to imagine that was not a great thing to be in the 19th century. Perhaps, certainly, African Americans and Jews were treated worse, but not a lot worse. And Byrne overcame these social barriers. He was elected president of the New York Bar Association, and more important, he was the first Catholic ever appointed to the board of governors of Harvard University, the Harvard Corporation, over many, many alumni objections, by the way. If you can, those who are my age will remember when JFK was elected and what a to-do there was about his religion. Well, you could imagine, 60 years earlier, what it was like to have a Catholic in Harvard. It was unthought of. Helen Byrne was not a Catholic. He married a Protestant for some reason. She's very important in this story because Planting Fields is in many ways her creation. I didn't get access to the original drawings, but we have the stable drawings here. And the stable drawings are a stable for Mrs. James Byrne. She's the client. So my supposition is that she was probably the one who was working with the architect. Byrne was very busy as a lawyer. My supposition is that they lived here year-round. They didn't have houses all over the country. This was their house. They had 4, at the time they built, they had 4 girls. Oyster Bay is a perfect place to raise a family. They had a stable with 10 stalls, which I imagine were full of ponies. So she's the one who starts this process going. She buys 163 acres. Locust Valley at this point was to the edge of development, of real estate development of this sort on Long Island. And the pioneer was Paul Cravath, who was a famous lawyer, if you know anything about legal history. He and Byrne had worked together, so they knew each other. And we know that one of the real estate lawyers who was advising Helen Byrne was a member of something called the Byrne Syndicate. So there is a definite connection between Cravath setting up here and with his partner. They both Cravath built a 600-acre estate right on the Sound, and his partner built an estate, and they encouraged their friends and partners and colleagues and clients to move out here. So Helen Byrne was what we would call an early adopter. She was ahead of everybody. And I assume with Cravath's advice, he said, just buy a lot of land. It's cheap, relatively. Don't worry, just get a lot. It'll be worth more in the future, which was, of course, true. So she bought 163 acres, which seems rather large. Then but she continued buying. She bought 613, she bought 87 acres. You can see that she was connecting to roads. She understood that there's no point in having a piece of land that was isolated. You need to have, that little piece she bought on the left side of the slide is very important later in the story. And in the end, she bought a piece across the road, which seems odd to me, but there it is. But she did buy then 70 more acres at the very end of owning this land, which connected her to another road, and it's kind of the back door to planting fields. So if you're bringing in a cartload of manure, you don't want to come through the front door. So 374 acres is what she bought. Coe enlarged it a little bit, so the number you usually hear is, I think, 406 or 407, but at this point it was 374. The architect they chose was a very interesting and imaginative choice. It was Grosvenor Atterbury, whom they had actually hired 5 years earlier. This is 1906, so in 1901 they had hired him to improve their townhouse in Manhattan, when he was really just starting out, probably 5 years in. So he was an unusual choice. The most famous project that we know of Atterbury's is Forest Hills Garden in Queens. He worked with Frederick Olmsted Jr., who was the town planner, and Atterbury did the architecture. This was started to be built 3 years after Planting Fields house, but it's the architecture I wanted to show you, because we, of course, don't have color pictures of the Planting Fields, but this is the sort of architecture he was thinking at the time. We would call it traditional. It's almost Germanic in some weird way, but I think for people of that time, he was really a modern architect. He wasn't a traditionalist. This is not a revival style. He's not trying to be Bavarian or German or anything like that. He's using traditional forms, but as you'll see in the planning of the house, it's very modern in many ways. Here's a black and white picture, very similar, except here the half timbering is timber rather than concrete, which it is in Forest Hills. And he pioneered the use of what was called lammy brick, which is overburnt brick, which gives this very rough texture. Again, not for historical reasons, but sort of to create essentially the equivalent of shingles in brick, because it gives this very rough texture. You can see it's very essentially picturesque. Atterbury did design, in Manhattan, he designed fairly conventional neoclassical townhouses, and some of his country houses are colonial, but a lot of them are this kind of original style. And if you went to Atterbury, you went because you liked what he did. You didn't hire him and say, give me a Tudor house or give me a Norman house. You liked his original style. And he compared this to I think in a far-fetched way, to an English country farmhouse. But it has that kind of casual, informal organization. This is a view from the back. The plan is really a very interesting plan. It's all organized around axes of movement. And so you enter on a diagonal into a kind of tower, and then you have this long view down to the living room, and then another axis to the dining room, and then a central axis, which turns out to be very important because it's still there. The house isn't there, as you'll hear, the house burned down. But some of these axes that he set up were so powerful and resonated with the landscape in a way that you'll see that they essentially got preserved. And so even though this is no longer there, it actually has an important influence on what Coe builds later. You can see it's a dogleg plan. So it's not a formal, it's not like a French chateau where you arrive in a courtyard and then you have a garden on the other side. You arrive in this kind of turnaround. You enter at a funny angle, and then your garden court is completely on the other side of the house. So he's able to create a sort of private garden-like space. And then on the right-hand side, you have the service wing. I wanted to show you the upstairs simply because a function, let me just go back one. Oops. A lot of the spaces in this house are outdoor spaces, and that's, I think, an important aspect of his modernity. There's a porch, there's a deck looking out on the lawns, there's a kind of porch looking onto the garden court, there's even a kind of porch looking into the entryway. So the house relates to the outside. In a way, for instance, if you're designing a chateau, you can't do that. A chateau has a door, and then you're inside, and that's it. The porches and things like that are not part of it. But this is, of course, before air conditioning, so it's important to have outdoor places where you can be without, whoops. This is a view down to the living room, that long sort of corridor which is open to one side, which it really is it functions as a gallery. Literally, a gallery was a long room with windows on one side and a convenient wall where you could hang pictures. And Helen Byrne had a large collection of art. She was an accomplished collector. We have records of her lending art to the Metropolitan Museum, and you can see all the mainly drawings and prints on the walls here. And you can see the architecture. Again, we would call it traditional, but it's not historical. It's not, there's even a kind of feeling at the entrance, especially with that bench, of a sort of oriental feeling, especially in the staircase railing. It's very accomplished. It's very beautiful. It's all this paneling, but as I said, it's what I think people at that time would have called modern. And I wanted to show you the upstairs because he also creates a lot of outdoor balconies and loggias, and almost every bedroom has a space outside where you could, and a large one off the bedroom suite, the master suite at the left side. There's a deck over the porch, but there's a loggia off the hall, and many of the bedrooms have access to outdoor spaces. They had 4 children, and they had four girls and then a boy who was born at Planting Fields. And you can see how well organized the house is. All the bedrooms for the family on one side, the parents are right at the end, where it's a little bit quieter. And then the guest rooms are around the corner. And then on the extreme right are rooms for staff, probably for the butler and the housekeeper. And they have this outdoor stair to sort of give them a sense of privacy. The house is gone, as we'll hear, but the most important thing I think that Atterbury did is he decided where to build it. And as you'll see, that was a key decision, because once the house burnt down, as you'll see, it had to be there. So that choice governed planting fields all the way through, as did the axial organization of the house, which in many ways affected the landscape design. The landscape was designed by James Greenleaf, not as popular a name as Olmsted, but an important landscape architect. Frederick Olmsted Jr. was president of the American Landscape Association, and Greenleaf followed him as president. And in those days, being president was important. The best architects were president. Sadly, no longer true, neither there or in the AIA. But in those days, the top guy was the top guy, and it was people like Burnham or McKim in terms of architecture. And Greenleaf was an important architect. He had an odd background. He was trained as a civil engineer, and he taught civil engineering at Columbia, and then had fed up with teaching, I'm not sure which, he decided to go into practice. He gave up teaching. He was a professor. He gave up teaching, went into practice, but he didn't, design bridges and dams. He designed landscapes. He was a landscape painter as a hobby, I suppose. And somehow he became very successful. He designed 30 or 40 big estates, some on the North Shore, some in New Jersey, some in the Oyster Bay area, and ended up, I think, designing several World War I cemeteries in Europe, American cemeteries, and was also, which is not a huge job, but it's a reflection of his importance. He was appointed the landscape architect for the Lincoln Memorial. What Greenleaf did, and he clearly was not hired, to do a huge garden. The Verns did have limited sort of money available, but he built on the axes that Atterbury had set up with his house. So the main one was this north-south axis that runs from the house. Then he created this circular pool, which is still there, and a kind of depressed lawn. There was a tennis court on one side, and a children's playhouse is that little box behind the tennis court. He also laid out a service area. We're not sure if the garage, which is that small structure, was actually built. The stable was built, and it was there for a long time. But you can see that you have this arrival using the geometry of the house and a turnaround, and then the beginning of what eventually became Vista Walk, which was that long north-south axis. I think it's a very beautiful landscape. The house kind of gets shrouded. It's really building up this notion that it's a picturesque sort of casual farmhouse, even though it has this rather imposing tower. Atterbury was not a shy architect, so he's not hiding his talents, but it's all overgrown. I think there was a picture, but which is interesting. It has awnings everywhere, which of course makes total sense. You can't put awnings on a Tudor house. It would look silly. So of course they didn't, but in Atterbury's case, he was able to do that. So I imagine these awnings as red and white, but I don't, maybe they're another color. They're striped. They're certainly some sort of color. And you notice virtually, this is all facing south. All the south-facing openings, even the loggia, has these big awnings, which of course makes total sense because you don't have air conditioning and you're dealing with a hot climate in the summer times. So you get this very rich planting that he creates around the house, and I think very beautiful. I go into this in my essay, but I won't go into it. We're not sure why, but starting around 1911, Helen Byrne rents the house out. Whether they had financial problems, whether this was part of a kind of investment plan, they moved around a lot. So they would buy a house, fix it up, like the Atterbury house, but then 5 years later they have a different address. So she was building up their I should have said a little bit about her. She was born in Terre Haute, Indiana. We know a little bit, her parents were Scots. They were the children of immigrants. Her father was a well-off businessman who also dabbled in real estate. And then we don't know anything until she marries Byrne when she's in her late 20s. He's almost 40. So it's a late marriage for both of them. She's called a New Yorker by then, so she's been living here. We don't know what she did. She's clearly a businesswoman, and whether she got that from her Scottish genes or just watching her father, I'm not sure. But she's ambitious, and she's also not independently wealthy. Her father dies and presumably leaves her something, but it's not like a fortune. So in a way, she's building up her fortune through these things. So we can sort of think perhaps that's why she rents out. In any case, she rents, the first tenants she has are Mary and William Coe. They've been renting a house in New Jersey for the summer, and they rent planting fields for the summer, and they come here. And then she rents to another tenant. And in 1913, she sells. I should say, in 1913, she buys more land, and then she sells. So it's even more puzzling, because she buys 70 acres, and a few months later sells the whole thing to Coe. So whether it was just an opportunity that arose, and that's that southern piece that gives her the back door to the estate. In any case, she does finally sell to Coe for the equivalent of today of about $3 or $4 million. So it's a significant amount of money. The whole family goes to Europe, so you can make of that what you will, but they travel around Europe, the kids go to school in Florence, and so clearly it's a windfall for the Byrne family. There's William Coe in one of those English outfits that John mentioned last night, and his wife, Mary. They're both interesting characters. Not quite as interesting as the Byrnes, in my opinion, but interesting. Coe was born in England, and he was brought here when he was 14, 13. He was one of a very large family, about 10 kids. And he didn't go to high school because he immediately started working as an office boy in an insurance company in Philadelphia. The family lived in New Jersey. And the insurance company he worked for was bought by a very large marine insurance company in New York. I can't remember the name offhand, but it was one of the largest marine insurers in the world. They insured, it's hardly a credit, the Titanic. But Coe started as office boy. He ended up running the thing. So he was pretty remarkable. I mean, insurance is not my favorite industry, but he did well. He worked his way up. He ended up, of course, moving to New York to the head office. And when he married Mary Coe, he was, I think, running their one of the major departments, the underwriting department of this marine insurer. Mary Coe was also an unusual person. She was the daughter of one of the richest men in America. So basically he married an heiress, one of the probably richest heiresses in the country. And I'll talk a little bit more about her father. But when she was 17, she eloped. So she inherited from her father not just money, but a really tough disposition, as you'll see in a minute. She eloped, and the father was having none of it, and he ended up taking it to court, divorcing, proving that her husband had many affairs, mainly with prostitutes, and getting the marriage annulled. So when she married Coe, this was a few years later, he was a widower. His wife was from Savannah. She had died without children after only a couple of years. But the important person for planting fields is really Henry Rogers, because he paid for this place. I mean, everything that we see that the Coes have done is because Henry Rogers left $1 billion when he died, to be divided among 4 children. He was not a philanthropist. Nobody outside the family got anything. And he set up a very interesting will, which is too complicated to go into. But he was a builder. He was a very wealthy, but not because he didn't inherit money. He created wealth. He was an oil man. He built refineries. So he wasn't just digging, drilling for oil. He was building refineries. He ended up selling his refineries to Rockefeller and becoming a major figure in Standard Oil. But he went on. He built streetcar systems, copper mines, and he also built a railroad, the Virginian Railroad, which was actually half of his wealth came from that. It was called the richest little railroad in the world, and it was a coal hauling railroad. It was in West Virginia, and he built it. I mean, he didn't buy it. He created it. So he was called the last of the robber barons, and his nickname was Hellhound Rogers. So you can imagine the sort of character he was. And here he is with his chum, Samuel Clemens. They were best friends. When the Coes moved to planting fields, Helen Byrne had done a bit of landscaping with Greenleaf, but not a lot. I don't think they really had the resources. So the Coes hired Guy Lowell. He was from Boston, probably. She was born in Massachusetts, and I think that sort of Massachusetts connection was why they hired Lowell, because there were certainly plenty of people in New York they could have hired. Lowell is a very interesting architect because he's both a landscape architect and an architect. Of course, we have one sitting here too, in case of Laurie Olin. But he was trained as an architect, but then he went to study horticulture in Kew. Then he got a diploma from the Beaux-Arts, and he founded the first of two landscape architecture programs. He founded at MIT. Fred Olmsted Jr. started at the same time a program at Harvard. The Harvard one is better known because it survived. The MIT one was closed at one point, I think in the 40s or 50s. But he was a very successful landscape architect because he could do your house and your garden, or he could just do the garden. He did many projects where he only did landscape design, and he did other projects where he did the architecture as well. He's best known for the Fine Arts Museum in Boston. So he was an important architect. But he was brought in not for architecture, but for garden. They had lots of ideas about making it much grander than simply the immediate surroundings of the house. Guy Lowell's brother-in-law was Robeson Sargent. He's a mysterious figure. He's the son of Charles Sprague Sargent, who was the head of the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard. So he comes from a sort of lineage of people involved with landscape, but he has no training in landscape architecture. He went to Harvard College, but all I could find out was that he liked sports. And he didn't study in the science school, where many of the budding landscape architects at that point studied with Frederick Jr. I couldn't find a picture of him. I mean, this unfortunately is his grave marker. He didn't live long, as you'll hear. So it's hard to know. He is the point man of Lowell here. He's the man with all the correspondence between Coe and Lowell's firm goes through Sargent. So he's clearly has a role to play. He doesn't do huge things here in terms of landscape. The biggest things, I think, are much more connected to Lowell. The greenhouses, the Italian garden, all of that stuff, I think is very much Lowell's input because he was the experienced landscape architect as well as architect. So he knew about building, and Robeson didn't. I mean, he probably knew a lot about horticulture, which he would have sort of absorbed from his father and from being from the Arboretum and so on, and from his apprenticeship with Lowell. So what what he and Lowell did was, one is they planted the allée, they improved the planting to make a proper allée of the entrance road. He extended that axis from the house to make what we call Vista Walk. The sunken garden was the biggest project. One imagines that it's a project primarily initiated by May. And again, I imagine it's mainly Lowell who's involved. There's a lot of construction in a sunken garden with a pool and so on. So Sargent is probably doing more involved in the day-to-day planting aspect of it, and Lowell is involved in the kind of the overall plan. There's a small structure at the end which is also slightly mysterious. We don't know who designed the structure. We know who designed the interior of it. It's a tea house. It's a beautiful little gem. If you know planting fields, I'm sure you've seen it. And it was the work of Everett Shinn, who was a painter, also an unusual sort of character, because he's associated, you wouldn't guess this from the left-hand slide, with the Ashcan school. He was a realist. He would paint bums in the street and people sort of hanging out. He was also a fan of theater, not sort of like Degas. He did do ballet, but he also did popular theater, vaudeville, which is what this is. And this is a painting which is in Crystal Bridges Museum. So he was a serious, recognized painter, but he also did murals and sort of interior decoration. He was criticized for it by his Ashcan colleagues because it didn't seem like the right thing. But he had a bigger, I suppose, talent than simply that couldn't be. Didn't quite fit one thing. He also worked for Sam Goldwyn in Hollywood for several years, doing sort of, I assume, some kind of set design. And there are still some existing Shinn murals in the city today. There were 2 greenhouses built. The Palm House is a kind of more traditional big greenhouse with, as you see, palm trees. There's a plunge bath in the middle. And then partway through, probably with Sargent's input, or at least information, Coe bought a very large collection of camellias from England. And of course, they wouldn't survive the winters here, so they had to build a camellia house, a greenhouse for them, which is attached to the old stable, which is that little building across the front. Coe got involved in thoroughbred horse rearing, and he had this really big stable barn built. I mean, you can see a very large, much larger than the house in terms of footprint. There were also garages. I'll talk about the architects in a little bit. But that required, laying out landscaping around it, the court, and so on. And all of that was all work that Lowell and Sargent would do. In 1918, 2 bad things happened at Planting Fields. One was that Sargent died. He died in his sleep. He was 41. We don't know of what. It was quite a very tragic thing, certainly for his family. But it was also tragic for the Coes because they had come to rely very much on him. He was the sort of contact person. Lowell would come once in a while. He was doing other projects, big architecture projects. But the sort of day-to-day contact was all done with Sargent, so they kind of lost that. And 2 weeks later, this place burnt down. Mayco had this idea of turning the porch into a sunroom. It was an open porch, so a sunroom meant putting glazing in, but also she hired an artist who we'll see in a minute to do some murals inside to pretty it up. She wasn't crazy about Tudor, I'm convinced. It's sort of dreary. So she wanted to liven it up. And the workers were, it's not clear from the newspaper accounts exactly what they were doing, but they had a blowtorch and they were somehow applying wax or something on top of the mural or melting it. Anyway, they started a fire. The fire spread. It turned out there wasn't enough water pressure to get any proper sort of hose on it. But when the fire department finally showed up, there was no water available, so they had to run a line probably half a mile to a nearby estate that had a big pond. I mean, there's no pond here. There's no water source. So by the time that was all done, the house was gone. The servants cleared out all the furniture. It was a slow fire. They couldn't stop the fire, but they had enough time. You can imagine it starts here, and then it goes sort of that way. So they took out paintings, furniture, and so on. But the house was a complete loss. So now, they have this beautiful estate. They've got this Italian garden. They've got this wonderful tea house, the greenhouses, but they don't have a house. And I get the impression that doesn't set him back at all. He's a pretty tough character. As you imagine, to go from office boy to CEO, you have to have a lot of grit. And so that little house at the very bottom of the slide is an old farmhouse. So he had it fixed up. He had landscaping put in properly around it, so he wasn't slumming. He wanted a proper interim house, and that's what they moved in. And meantime, they worked with the architects to create a new house. So who did they hire? I mean, I get the impression they weren't crazy about Lowell for some reason. And maybe he was a Boston Brahmin. He was probably a bit of a snob. Coe was, after all, it has to be said, a low-class Englishman. He was not a high-class person at all. Perhaps Lowell lorded it over. In any case, they didn't go to Lowell. They didn't go to Atterbury. I'm not sure why, but at that point, the main reason was that Coe already had architect. He had his architect. The stables and the garages had all been built by these architects who was a Manhattan firm of Walker and Gillette. Walker and Gillette had designed a lodge for Coe in Wyoming. You heard from Gina that they had bought this ranch, thousands of acres. I'm not sure if it's a ranch or just a lot of mountaintop or something, but they built a lodge. They did have cattle there, but they also had hunting, and it was a beautiful place just outside the national park. And he hired Walker and Gillette to design a proper lodge for him there, which is sort of like a Adirondack lodge in appearance. Apparently it was sort of green and brown and white trim and shingled. Walker and Gillette was a kind of typical partnership in those days. Stuart Walker had the social connections. He had married well, his father was connected, so he could pull in the clients, and Gillette had the talent. Gillette was a graduate of Penn. He had gone to the Beaux-Arts. He placed second in the entry exam for the Beaux-Arts, which is a really big deal. I mean, it was hard to get into the Beaux-Arts, but to place second in the exam, so he was clearly a talented guy. You know that because he's wearing these round glasses. So clearly the round glasses are much earlier than Le Corbusier. Maybe we should call them Gillette glasses and not Corbusier glasses. Anyway, they were very different architects than Atterbury. They were the kind of architects that you could go to and say, I want this style or that style. And then they would do you a perfect interpretation of that style. They were very highly competent professionals, and they were actually recognized architects. We don't remember their names today. They're not as famous as John Russell Pope, for instance. But they were recognized as important residential architects in the same class as Pope and Atterbury and Bertrand Goodhue, for example. So Coe had his architects, and you know, the relationship between client and architect, especially in residential work, is a very personal one. So either you hate the architect and you never hire him again, but if it turns out that you're sort of on the same wavelengths and they do a good job and you like what they do, you stick with them. It's a kind of natural thing. So he approached them to design the house for him. I should say they had done this rather beautiful house in Southampton for May's brother. So it was one of the sons of Rogers. The house is no longer there, but there's this old photograph. It was a beachfront house, and the Olmsted brothers did this, what looks like a really spectacular garden, a walled garden behind the house. And the house is unusual because it's entered from the narrow end. You can see there's a road running down the left side of the slide, and then you've got a very small little courtyard there, because of course most of the rooms you want the sea view. This house is really an Italian villa, but a very casual kind of. I think it would have been a perfect style for this place, because somehow you want a house. You may not. They obviously didn't want a house exactly like the Atterbury house. They didn't. Perhaps they didn't like it. It was just a bit too much for them. But this would have been, I think, a nice fit. But that's not what Coe wanted. Coe wanted a Tudor house. He says in one of his letters, or I'm sure he says in one of his oral histories, that he told the architects, I don't want a colonial house, I want a Tudor house. And Coe, of course, was British, and so he wanted a house that somehow, I think, resonated with that. He arrived here when he was 12, I think. He kept his English accent all his life. I mean, I arrived here when I was 10, and I had an English accent, and it took about 2 years before it disappeared. So he worked on it, I think. I think in America, it's not a bad thing to be British. It's a bad thing to be Irish at that time, but not British. So I think he used that. Anyway, he wanted a Tudor house, and there were two very large Tudor houses nearby. One is Killenworth, and one is Ormstown in Oyster Bay, designed by the great architect of that time, Bertram Goodhue. And these are kind of unusual, Norman, because they're not replicas of anything. The first Tudor houses in America, which date from much earlier, maybe 10, 20 years earlier, are really kind of replica houses. So they're old, they have saggy roofs, they're meant to look like an old Tudor house. Whereas these houses use Tudor elements, but they're really modern houses which use the Tudor language. I just remembered a quote from Robert Stern. Somebody accused him of, copying. How can you do these old houses? And he said, it's like English. If you speak English, you're speaking the language of Shakespeare, but you're not saying the same things. You're saying other things with the language. So that's what architects like Goodhue and Ackerman were doing. They were using Tudor, but not to look like Tudor, but to say something else. That wasn't what Coe wanted. He really wanted a more traditional Tudor house, which was a house that looked like a Tudor house, as if the Tudors had come here and built a house. And so the architects sent him books of old country houses from England, and they ended up choosing two that he liked, and it was sort of, I like this for the back and this for the front. That sounds like a strange way to design a house, but I think for primarily Gillette, it was helpful, because he had a real problem, which is how do you fit a house into a garden that's already there? And you've got the arrival road, you've got these, obviously the gardens near the house had been destroyed, but probably within 20, 30 feet they were fine. So you've got these axes that are already there. So what Gillette did was a very kind of common sense thing, which is he respected all that, and he created a dogleg plan that was very similar to the original house. It's got a porch at one end, it's got the living room where we are off the porch, and it's got the service wing at the other end. The difference is that the Coe house is larger, so you can see the service wing on the right extends way beyond the original house. They did not reuse the foundations, so the shape has nothing to do with what was there in terms of foundations. It was really respecting. Atterbury was so good about figuring out views and orienting the house that there was no reason to change that, I think. And so they, even though they were doing a very different sort of house, they followed that dogleg layout, but they extended a little bit. And of course, it's very different on the inside. It isn't laid out with axes the way Atterbury did. There's sort of two main axes, but it's very much, I would say, a rabbit warren. I've been in this house now several times. I always get lost. I never know where I am. And I think that's because what they were trying to do was not what Atterbury did. They were trying to create a sense of a house that grew over time, and that this piece was added, and then there's a piece when you enter in the hall that looks like it used to be outside and now it's inside because the house has grown. And so they were doing a very different sort of thing, and inevitably, if you can't lay it all out neatly because then it looks too planned. It has to look accidental. If you look at the outside, you've got funny connections between things, and that sense of a house that grew is very much there. I should speed up a little bit. There it is. And there are bits like this is almost classical with the columns and the arches. It's not medieval. You've got a kind of cloister that is medieval, but then the entrance is almost Christopher Wren, or these twisted columns and the broken pediment. So it's very much the sense of a house that got assembled from bits and pieces over the years. The interior is mostly Tudor, as I think the client wanted. The dining room, sort of, as I said, it's kind of dreary because you've got a lot of heavy paneling, which has to be dark. That's the Tudor style. You can't have too many windows, but you've got a very unusual room in the back, which is the breakfast room. And here I think I see May's hand. It's her money, after all. So I don't know what the relations between the two of them were, but I would imagine that there was an unspoken agreement that, after all, it was her money, so she had a little bit more say than if it had been all his. And she hired Robert Chandler, who was a well-known artist in New York, known for a number of things, but he did also a lot of murals. And I think in a diplomatic way, she had him do a mural of Wyoming with buffalo, which is what her husband was interested in. He was a real devotee of Western history and Western sort of lore. His house he had bought from Bill Cody, Buffalo Bill Cody. They became friends. And so having this theme of buffaloes and the Western landscape was I think, placated her husband, because after all, it's a completely weird room. I mean, it's certainly not Tudor, it's not anything. There are vultures on the ceiling. I mean, it's a wonderfully weird room, and I think I quote in my essay, I think Walker writes a letter to, and he says, it's very interesting. And you can see him cringing between the lines. But May had her own ideas about rooms, and the reception room was her room, where her friends could come. It's downstairs opposite his den, and it's got nothing to do with Tudor. It's a French 14th, 15th century room with paneling, yellow, different. The furniture all comes from Paris, not supplied by the same dealer who supplied the rest of the house. And then in her bedroom, she had Chandler do this really strange mural. This is a recreation because Coe's second wife destroyed the mural. And it's a kind of weird jungly scene, sort of like Rousseau with stylized jungle plants. And again, completely different than the rest of the house. Has nothing to do with Tudor. And it has to do with her interest in the arts. She had traveled to Europe. She was familiar with all those things. And finally, I'll go quickly through the landscape architecture because Patricia's going to talk to you much more about that in a few minutes. But the firm, John Charles Olmsted was the senior partner of Olmsted Brothers, and he died in 1920. He had cancer, so I assume by 1918 he was not fit, 100% fit anymore. And the firm that really did planting fields is these three men, which was Frederick Olmsted Jr., who's in the middle, who's mainly at this point doing city planning, town planning, suburban layouts. Laura's going to talk about that. He was president, the first president of the American Planning Association. He was a planner as well as a landscape architect. And and then Frederick Dawson and Percival Gallagher are the two first associates and then partners. The very first partner was Fred Dawson, and he is the person from Olmsted Brothers who's responsible for the work that you see at Planting Fields. They were at this point doing scores of gardens, private gardens, all over the country. So you shouldn't imagine that he's sort of spending weeks and weeks here. He's coming through periodically, checking things out. He has nurseries that he's dealing with. He has people here that he's trained, gardeners that he has confidence in. And then they're, of course, in constant communication, correspondence in terms of deciding things. And of course, Coe is not here all year round either, because he's either in Wyoming or he's in the city. But it's Dawson who we really should see as the landscape architect who's primarily involved here. His job is really to finish things off, to tie them together, to do some new things, but to sort of pull the whole thing together and to bring the really impressive resources of Olmsted Brothers. By this time, they have more than 30 people in Brookline. And so it's to sort of, you know, there was this rock and roll producer, they call it something sound. And you would, what was it? I don't know his name. You would bring him on when you were recording, and he would give you this lush kind of sound. And this is back in the 60s or 50s. Yes, exactly. So the Olmsted Brothers are a little bit like that. They're giving the Olmsted treatment to planting fields. And they're kind of knitting it all together so it looks like one thing, not like several things. And so he was involved with the entry court. He finished the garden court. You can see it's much lusher than what we saw before. They just pile it on. They're really excessive by modern lights. He creates a new walk next to Vista Walk, an azalea walk, a little bit more curvy. He designs the lawns, which nobody had really designed. They were just mowed grass. I think it's one of his best things at planting fields. I don't know what you call them. They're not like the meadows at Central Park. I mean, they've got specimen trees kind of dotted around. They're sloping and bumpy, and then there's that weird rock that pops up. So it's an odd but a very moving and very effective way of doing. Remember, the problem with Tudor and landscape is there were no Tudor gardens surviving. So the landscape architect couldn't sort of be Tudorish because we didn't know what that meant. So that gave him a kind of free hand. On the other hand, he had to deal with what Greenleaf and Sargent and all those people had done and respect that too. So he didn't rip things out. He really built on them. He also had a tricky client. He got this letter back from Coe saying, there's all this wonderful beech copse. We should have one of those. And, you know, then it's up to him to figure out. So he put it at the end, it's now being replanted, so there's like little beeches. But this is when it was a big beech, when it actually grew out. So it was not the easiest client to deal with because by then, Coe was pretty knowledgeable, or at least imagined himself knowledgeable, which is the same thing. And when he traveled, he would see things and buy things and order things, and it was up to Dawson to figure out how to put it all in. He redid the Camellia Regan's house. He built a new greenhouse. The last thing he did, and you'll hear more about this, was a drive to the gates. Because one of Coe's purchases when he went to England one time was these huge gates. They're 100 feet wide, they're about 18 feet high, from the 18th century. And Coe had this idea of putting them where we drove in this morning. And Dawson said, that doesn't make sense. It's like it's a little country road, and there's no space, and you're going to have a 100-foot wide gate in the middle of the forest. It's not going to look good. What we need is to put it somewhere where we can create a forecourt and really see it from both sides. And so and Coe agreed, and they erected it at the other end of the estate, where they are now, off Chicken Valley Road, which, despite the goofy name, is actually an important road. So it's the road where people would see it. And I realized that was a big part of it. It's like, if you're going to spend, he spent several $100,000 on these gates, you want to show them off a little bit. And here, the first thing I ever saw of Planting Fields was those gates. I didn't know it was Planting Fields. I just said, there's somebody's big house behind those gates. And that's what you want. That's the purpose of the gates. And so Dawson designed this really attractive area in front to create a forecourt, and also to create space behind, so they're not just stuck surrounded by trees. It becomes an experience. Very quickly, that's the end of my story. By the 1930s, the Olmsted brothers are pretty much finished. Dawson dies in 1941, but in the meantime, he keeps corresponding and they keep in touch. But so for 49 years, it's a private house. This is a view, by the way, of Atterbury's entrance. There aren't many photographs of it. And this is Coe with his 4 children. But as Gina mentioned, then there's this other story, which is not my story, but it's an important story, where it becomes much livelier. It becomes more like Animal House than The Great Gatsby. It's full of students. I mean, this place, they had dances in it and events, and fortunately it was the 50s and 60s, so they didn't destroy the house. I would hate to try it today. I don't think it would be as happy, but in those days the house got pretty well preserved, and they had a library in that room, and you see students studying with these funny animal heads on the walls. Of course, then it became an arboretum, so a place, which is, in a way, I think what Coe really hoped for the place. And then just a park, a place where people walk, and of course a place for very special events. So all these people have different experiences of planting fields. So it's a cultural landscape, but it's kind of many cultures and many landscapes. And as John said yesterday, the only constant in a landscape is change, and that's certainly the case with planting fields. Thank you. I've run a little bit long, so not much time for questions, but one question? Any? Yes.
It's a personal question, but if the only thing that's constant in the landscape is change, which year would you have liked to have seen the landscape?
That's a good question. I mean, in some ways, when I was writing about it, it sort of perked up when it became a campus in a funny way, because rather than being empty for 9 months of the year, it was full of young people. And there are black and white photos from that period, and they're kind of cheery. They're playing volleyball out there, and they're studying in their rooms, and the bedrooms are seminar rooms, and so in a funny way, and it is this funny juxtaposition. I mean, the students look more like small adults than today. So you know, they have ties, and they kind of fit in, and they give a flavor to the place which is interesting, and which reminds us, you know, that this place was many places. As an architect, I like the Atterbury House the most because I really think it's the best designed house. But so I guess you have to pick your own time. I guess everybody would have a different time, and there's no reason that one necessarily has to contradict the other. I mean, you could come to this place and just say, I like walking in the forest, and you know, hiking in the forest is why I come here. I'm not interested in the house. I don't care who the codes were. It's just a nice place. So I think it's experienced by many people in different ways. I think I should stop here and pass to Patricia. Thank you.